Kia ora koutou and welcome to the Getting on Board Governance webinar session. My name's Helen Bartle and I'm the Senior Advisor for Audience Development and Capability Building at Creative New Zealand. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the sixth and final Getting on Board webinar for 2016, Information for Good Governance and making sure the board is getting and processing the information it needs. Today's webinar will be led, as always, by Graeme Nahkies from BoardWorks International. Graeme is also the author of the Getting on Board Governance Manual, and over the past year he has expertly brought to life the content in a very practical way of the manual, and today's session will be no exception. It will last for an hour and there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the midway point. Some of the things that Graeme will be discussing today will include how staff and boards can think afresh about what information boards need and why, and also the practical steps staff and board can take to improve the quality and relevance of what is reported to the board for good governance. If you have a question or comment during the presentation, just note it in the chat box on the left-hand side of your screen, and Graeme will answer it when we break. Both the recording of this webinar and the PowerPoint presentation will be made available via Creative New Zealand's website for reference after the session. And finally, a note for those of you who don't already know, these webinars can be used as a credit for continuing professional development if board members belong to the Institute of Directors or other professional bodies. So without further delay, it gives me great pleasure to introduce and hand over to Graeme.
Thank you, Helen. Good morning, everybody. Well, I'm going to structure this morning's webinar in three parts. Firstly, just talking generally about some of the challenges that boards and management teams face in supplying the sort of information that boards need. Helen, I think I'll take a brief pause at the end of that section as well. And then I'll go on to discussing what sort of information does a board need and why, and we'll have another brief break. And then finally a section on how might the information flow to the board be improved. So starting with the governance information challenge, if you go back to the 1990s, there was a popular discussion around the importance of organisations to succeed being what were called learning organisations. And I think a lot of those concepts are still equally valid. But it's very important for a board to be learning about the organisation it's governing and about the environment that it is operating in, because if it's not keeping up with that sort of information and knowledge, then the board is slipping behind. High quality information for governance is absolutely essential because it's the raw material the board depends on. The information needs to be provided to the board in a way which is easy to read and to access. When I talk about comprehensive and comprehensible, the comprehensive bit on the previous slide doesn't mean getting overwhelmed in the volume of material. It means covering off the main things that a board needs to know. You know, boards only have a limited amount of time to discharge a wide range of very real responsibilities. So boards and directors are very dependent on the quality of information they must engage with. Remember that boards have accountability, which is full-time, but they only work really on a part-time basis. So the quality of information to help them make the best use of that time is absolutely critical. From the boards and directors I work with to evaluate and find ways of improving their effectiveness, I routinely hear the comment that we get too much of the wrong stuff being information. So it's not just about the quantity of information, it's also about the quality. And if there's too much, obviously, there's a sense of being overwhelmed, or as I've hinted here, drowning in that information, but the quality is also extremely important. A way of helping to think about quality of information is this little knowledge pyramid. It's a useful conceptual tool because it helps us differentiate between different levels of processing of the information that a board might get. Generally, boards, I guess, suffer in a sense from having information which is too low down that hierarchy. So a lot of just raw data dumped on them at times without any sort of interpretation or organisation. Stepping it higher up, sometimes boards, in fact often, boards get organised data which is well organised in a sense, and it's the way it's presented. But it often lacks a context for interpreting it, or it lacks a frame within which the board members can get a sense of what is really important and what they should take from that. So, what is the problem? There are many factors that contribute to it, and some common ones are shown on this slide and the next one. So, for example, reporting criteria are not really clear. In other words, the staff aren't clear what information the board needs. And a starting point for understanding what information a board needs is really the board's policy. But if there is a lack of policy, or if the board and management together do not apply or implement that policy, there's no reference point. Often there's a problem, and this is not just in the arts and cultural sector, this is almost universal. Strategic plans, which actually are more management than governance documents, and so they tend to be expressed in terms of what management is going to do rather than the outcomes that management is going to produce. Another factor is that the delegations, the authority that staff have in particular, is not always clear either. So in terms of reporting compliance, it's sometimes quite difficult for managers to know what is it that they should be reporting back to the board to help the board understand how things are going. And related to that, performance measures, which apply to both the organisation and to the chief executive in particular, are often poorly designed. So they're often related to things that are easy to measure rather than things that are worthwhile measuring. Another factor that boards often suffer from is that reporting is not timely, so the information they get is often too late, and it may be too late in the sense of being out of time and being overtaken by events, or it might be that the reporting is not timely enough for the board members to have a chance to review the material and to understand it before they go into a meeting, for example. Another factor is that neither the board nor the staff really understand the board's role, and consequently they're really not sure what information they should be exchanging with each other. Boards also tend to follow rather than lead, and in other words, they tend to wait for management sometimes to tell them what information they should have, and that leads management to be feeling that they're working in a vacuum and they have to guess what the board needs. And the safest thing for staff to do in that sort of situation is to over-report and provide more information than perhaps the board thinks is useful. And the next comment is about unprocessed data, and I think I've probably covered that off already, but it's just too much raw material without really sufficient analysis and interpretation for the board to know what to take from it. And then in terms of written reports, and a lot of information boards get is in that form, those reports are poorly written, poorly structured, and often have been prepared for another purpose, and therefore they're not in a form which is useful to the recipients when the recipients are the board members themselves. So I've covered off in a preliminary way, some of the sort of contextual things, maybe that other people have got other things that they would add to that list, but those are the sorts of things that I find are particularly relevant to the challenge that boards face here.
Thanks, Graeme. If anyone has a question or wants to actually ask Graeme a question directly, just type in the chat box on the left-hand side. Otherwise, we can keep going, and then we can come back to any questions that you might have later on in the session. So it doesn't appear as if anyone has any questions at this stage.
Okay, let's keep going then.
Yeah.
So the next topic is around what is the information that a board needs and why does it need it? And for me, the starting point is really the key tasks that a board has. And, the board's job, in a sense, conceptually, is quite simple. And as I've described on that slide, in the first place, it's to make sure that the organisation achieves what it should, that it delivers benefits for the people that the organisation exists to serve. And in doing so, in pursuing the activities that would provide those benefits, the board also has to make sure that the organisation is not harmed by the processes by which those outcomes are delivered, or that it's not blindsided by events in its operating environment. So there's a whole bunch of things around risk management, which perhaps we'll talk a bit more about later on. So if you look at those two key things, to make sure the organisation achieves what it should and it stays safe in the process, then a lot of the information a board needs flows from and supports those two things. I think starting with the environment in which the organisation is operating, it's very important for the board to have a good understanding of the operating environment. And boards have to work quite hard at doing that. One of the things that I find really useful with the boards that I work with is that we have what I often refer to as a radar screen discussion very early on in a meeting. And the purpose of that is just briefly to go around the table and to understand what each board member feels is going on in the operating environment, what new information has come to hand as they've been in communication with their own networks and their own day job, and perhaps even in their own social environment. So there's a whole bunch of things that you pick up from reading, from watching TV, from talking to people, your general networking, and those things need to be tabled so that the board has a clear sense of how quickly things are shifting in the environment, what are the new blips on the radar screen, to continue using that analogy, and to be able to have a collective sense of where does the organisation sit in the ecosystem in which it operates. What is its current position, if you like, and who are the other players, and what's happening in that operating environment that might be relevant. For example, at the moment, it's perhaps not a comfortable example to use, but funding is very challenged at the moment simply because people aren't buying enough lotto tickets, and that's being having quite significant impact on the arts and cultural sector. Another thing to do in relation to that radar screen discussion, although you don't want that to become too prolonged, often it's just a question of registering the new blips and perhaps documenting those for further exploration. But it is worthwhile quickly checking around the table is what do we make of those new blips? Do people think that they are significant? How important might it be to keep track of those or to find further information in relation to those? So that radar screen discussion can also be quite a useful thing in the context of board meetings, which we've talked about in previous webinars, making the best use of the board's meeting time and having a start like this sort of discussion actually immediately gets board members into a helicopter and gets them sitting above the organisation rather than getting buried in operational detail. One of the things that it's worth acknowledging, and I don't know how many people might have read it, but last year the Auditor General did a review of governance in the arts, cultural and heritage sector. It was published in May. I'm sure it's easily acquired off the Auditor General's website, but it was interesting for example, that she placed particular emphasis on boards having a good understanding of their stakeholder environment. There's a piece in Getting on Board about stakeholder analysis, which is probably worthwhile having a look at in the light of her comments. I think what she was saying was boards don't seek enough information nor organise it well enough around those stakeholder perceptions and expectations. The second thing second reason for boards needing information is that they need to be able to understand how the organisation operates in the sense of what are the variables that impact on its performance. What are the levers, perhaps, that the board and management can pull to improve the organisation's performance? So this is something often we think about when new board members are being inducted, but perhaps then lose sight of it later on. But it's worthwhile continuing to have a consciousness about having the whole board understanding how the organisation actually functions. If it was a business, we would say, does the board understand how the organisation, how does the company make money? Well, the equivalent of that in an arts organisation will be, how well do we understand what it is that will attract audiences, for example. So having a good sense of what those variables are that affect performance flows through also into the design of performance measures and monitoring regimes. And it's just something which is often subconscious, but what I'd encourage is that it becomes a more conscious search for information, a more conscious inquiry process that a board undertakes in relation to information. I touched briefly on risks before, the sorts of things that might stand in the way of the organisation achieving what it should. The board's responsibility for risk assurance actually requires quite a lot of activity in relation to identifying what I call characterising risk and communicating that risk, discussing it between board and management. It may be necessary to communicate that also to other key stakeholders. It's supporting the board's discussion about how those risks should be managed and mitigated. And it also creates a framework whereby the board might monitor risks. I think one of the things that's quite important here is that boards often have a reasonably formal risk register, and that's usually a management-generated document, and boards often receive that as a routine part of a board meeting. But I would argue that they don't spend enough time actually delving into that. It's too easy for that risk register to become, as a source of information, just something which gives comfort but which doesn't engage the board's own thinking processes. That's information, an information flow that the board should take more notice of and add more to it itself. You'd expect, because of their different roles and responsibilities, that boards would have a different perception of risk and the information they need around risk than perhaps the management team does. Obviously, boards need information to assist it to make good decisions. One of our recent webinars was on board decision making, and we touched on some of the issues around making good decisions and the process for that at that time. But in a strictly information context, there's a bunch of reasons why the board would want information and things they'd want information about to feed into the decision-making process. So information, for example, that will help them to refine and agree on what the objective of the decision is. Why is the proposal in front of them? Why is it important? Why is the timing significant, and that sort of thing. So to fully understand and agree with that objective right from the outset. Obviously, resources are always short in an organisational context, and so the board needs to have a really good understanding of the resources that might be applied to the decision that's being made. And that's not just in terms of the financial investment, but obviously there are a lot of other resources get consumed as an outcome of a particular decision. Boards also need to have information that informs them about the constraints that the organisation faces in making that decision, and constraints in relation to the implementation of that decision were they to make it. They want information about the alternatives, and often boards, when they face a decision, have very limited information about the alternatives that management has considered and excluded, and which are not considered in a proposal that comes to the board. So it's inevitable that boards, or at least some board members, will want to have information about some of those alternatives that were considered and excluded. That's something that management can do to help the board by anticipating those sorts of questions and providing that information. Decisions are frequently predicated on a bunch of forecasts and assumptions. Obviously, the decision-making proposal will forecast what the impact of that is going to be, hopefully, if everything comes together. I think it's also important, though, that the board asks management for what are the most important assumptions that they have made in putting together the proposal. And that might be, for example, assumptions about how much it's going to cost over the lifetime of the investment. It might be assumptions about, in an arts, performing arts context, what are the audience assumptions that have been made. And there's a whole bunch of those sorts of things that a board really needs information on if it's going to make a really well-considered decision. That's why I think in that decision-making webinar, I talked about the ideal being that a board would have two steps in the decision-making process. Receive an initial proposal from management, but to use that as an opportunity to explore some of these things before a final proposal comes to the board. And that makes it easier from a staff point of view because they know the sorts of information that the board is going to want to apply to that final decision. It's also important to have some sort of process for monitoring organisation and chief executive performance. And that's probably something which boards do reasonably well in the sense that they get regular reports on, for example, performance against budget or performance against plan. But certainly it's a really important conversation for the board to have about whether planned proposed results are actually being achieved. Another factor which is quite important from a governance perspective is management's actions that they've taken in pursuit of particular outcomes policy compliant. Are they consistent in a broader sense of policy with the organisation's values? Has the management team stayed within the sort of policy limitations, the boundaries that have been set for them in terms of the authority that's been granted to them? And that's something that we've discussed previously in relation to governance policy. Thirdly, are the actions that have been taken consistent with how the organisation sees itself and what's important to it in a behavioural sense? So often those values are not explicit, but they are implicit in the policy, but it's also important for the board to have specific conversations about those things from time to time. As again we've said in previous webinars, the means don't, or the ends don't justify the means, and it's very important in terms of organisational reputation and credibility that the things that an organisation does is consistent with stakeholder expectations. Are we measuring the right things? One of the things that somebody once said was it's better to have an okay or even an average measure of the right thing than a perfect measure of the wrong thing. the problem that we face in many organisation settings is that the easiest thing to measure is activity, what people do. And that doesn't tell a board very much at all other than where the staff have been busy. It's often quite difficult to measure impact or outcomes, but those are the right things. And so the board will want to have information, and even if that information may have some variability in it, at least you're trying to measure the right things. And finally, in terms of this slide, is the information on which the evaluation is being based, is that information valid and is it reliable? The reliability is a pretty important issue because, you know, as you probably know, sometimes data collecting agencies change the basis on which statistics, for example, are collected. So it's important to keep track of those types of things to make sure that what the information is that's being received can be interpreted in the right sort of context. And the final step, and it's sort of a closing of the loop for me, is that there needs to be some process of review and evaluation. This is a bit different from monitoring decisions as they are being implemented or the normal business as usual as it's progressing. This is more in retrospect, and it's something that few boards do unless they are particularly disciplined. So in relation to policy, for example, reviewing whether the information the board is receiving through that monitoring process, is the policy working? Is it having the impact that was hoped? Is it still relevant to the conditions that face the organisation? And do people sitting around the board table who have possibly changed in the interim, do they fully understand what the policy intent was and how it should still be operating? It's also important to evaluate decisions post their implementation, so that going back to the concept of the board being in a learning mode, was it a good decision? In retrospect, did we have the information that we should have applied to the decision? Was there information that has subsequently come to light that we didn't and possibly couldn't have known? Were those key assumptions that were made at the time, were they clear to us at the time, and were they substantiated by what has happened subsequently? One of the things that often happens, as we all know, is that original cost estimates tend to be more on the optimistic side than not. So what do we learn from the process of estimating the costs, and what might we do to improve future decision making? And that's essentially what this review and evaluation process is about. It is about learning from past experience and helping us to feed that into future policy making and future decision making. So, Helen, I think we will pause here and see. I think there's probably some questions on the screen, although I haven't been following them as I've been talking. Do you want to
yes,
moderate
thanks,
that discussion?
Graeme. Yeah, there's a question from Elizabeth Kerr, and she wants to know, well, she's saying that boards often drown in financial data, and those not competent in this area often leave it to others to analyse and comment. So wonders if you have any advice on how financial information can be presented to boards in a way that members can digest and use. Very good question.
Yeah, it is a good question, and Elizabeth has anticipated what I'm going to talk about next.
Right.
So if she doesn't mind, I'll take that in the next section because I will explore that explicitly. So thank you for that prompt, though.
Great. Okay. Does anybody else have a question for Graeme at this midway point? As I was pointing out, probably no question is, the wrong one, and I'm sure others would benefit, in terms of, or even any comments or observations would be useful to others, if there are any.
Helen, just while people are thinking, I might just comment on that explicitly, that we really expect board members to ask a lot of questions because, in a sense, a good board meeting is a process of inquiry. It's about digging deeper into the information. It's about testing assumptions. It's about a number of the things that I've talked about. And that requires board members to be quite proactive in asking questions. And if they have a question that for some reason they decide not to ask, that's perhaps the only thing that I would define as a dumb question, the question that might be important but doesn't get asked. And it's often the case that people sort of self-censor around questions. They might say, oh, well, this is a dumb question that, I assume all my colleagues know the answer to that already. But actually, those dumb, or what I prefer to call intelligently naive questions, are often the things that really draw out improved understanding or set up a requirement for improved information to be provided in respect of that matter. So I'd encourage all of you who are board members to be quite proactive in asking questions and thinking of the board meeting process as essentially an inquiry process, getting to the point where every board member is satisfied that they have the information and importantly, the level of understanding that they need in order to be confident in the decisions that they're making or the conclusions that they reach.
Exactly. Thank you. Tani Mahuta Gray wants to know, what are the key elements to inquire within a CEO performance review that is being undertaken by the board?
I think you have to go back to what are the expectations that the board has set for the chief executive. And so ideally, that would go back to the plans that the board has approved. Sometimes I see chief executive performance measures which actually are almost peripheral to what the chief executive and the board's real job are. They often relate to matters which really are not about moving the organisation forward, but may be quite specific to, say, an individual board member's interest in something. So ideally, the board will have and be able to express clarity about what their performance expectations are of the organisation in the first instance. And then from that, and the answers to that might be reflected in the strategic plan or a business plan or something like that. The chief executive's performance measures should flow out of that. But quite often it will be the case that the board weights those different elements. So it might say to the chief executive in terms of an annual performance agreement, we expect you to get on with business as usual, but in terms of our strategic plan, here's the 2 or 3 key things that we want to achieve this year. And so the measures and therefore the reporting back to the board on performance should flow out of that.
That's great advice, thank you. And slightly related is a question from Emma Philpott, who's asking, would you weigh the importance of information provided to the board from, say, 1 to 6 as listed? That is, environmental scan would possibly be more important than review and evaluation, or should they be weighted equally?
I guess my instinctive response to that is to say that they should all be weighted equally because they are each attending to a piece of the board's job. So, in one sense, and I see this quite often, boards don't pay much attention to that environmental scan, or at least don't do it in a systematic sort of a way. But actually, the number of boards that keep getting caught napping because they haven't been alert to what's going on outside the organisation are quite, there's a lot of boards that get caught out like that. And one of the great values that a board brings to a management team is that they come in a sense from the outside world. They come in with all sorts of connections to other parts of the operating environment, and they can really complement what management gets out of their own inquiry process. And often what the management team is focused on is improving the internal aspects of organisational performance. So management tends to look inwards and downwards, and we want the board looking upwards and outwards at the operating environment. So I would say, even though probably that is the one of the six that's most neglected, it is something that should be equally weighted with some of the other ones. The one that boards probably do best and accept as the most central part of their job is probably the one about tracking whether the organisation is performing as per plans and so forth. So, financial reporting and those sorts of things, which are central to a lot of board meetings. That sort of monitoring information is something that boards often spend a lot of time on. And to be fair to management, when managers are accused of giving too much information, it's often because board members seek more and more detail about that monitoring aspect. Then it starts to pull them down into the operational detail and gets them bogged down in management's job.
That's great observations and fantastic advice. Thank you, Graeme. I think unless anyone else has a question, we should continue on. And if other questions arise, then feel free to note them down, and we'll have another chance for questions at the end. So thanks, Graeme. Okay. Well, look, in terms of this final section, I've added in here a number of things that I see happening in and around a wide range of board environments. And they may or may not apply to your particular organisations, but they are things that I'd really like to highlight and to explore a wee bit. And this might be something that subsequent questions can help tease out. They're in no particular order this time. So the first one is to encourage management reporting to boards to think of who their audience actually is. The problem often is that what goes to a board is information that's been prepared and formatted for a different purpose. Boards actually need information that's specifically prepared to support the process of governance rather than the practice of management. And that's the problem with a lot of board reporting, and it's where a lot of boards start to lose their way, because what is reported to them typically is what the chief executive and other members of the team have been doing, and that forces the board to be spectators to management activity rather than having information that stimulates the sort of conversations that should be happening around the board table. So what I see frequently is a bunch of papers that have been prepared maybe for internal management purposes, or they're documents that have been prepared for another purpose. Just to take one example of, a hypothetical example, I talked before about the Auditor General's report last year. Now, I can just imagine that would have just been dropped on a board for their information, right? What the board would really have appreciated, so that they didn't have to read that 40 or 50-page report. In fact, it could have been longer. It's a while since I looked at it. What they need is a 1 or 2 page cover note that says, hey, you need to know that the Auditor General has published this report. She's looked at governance processes in a cross-section of organisations in the sector, and here's her key conclusions, and here's what are the lessons that we may need to take out of that ourselves. So that's what I mean about preparing and thinking about who your audience is when you're reporting to a board. And remember, as I commented at the start, boards only work part-time, and very few board members in the sector get paid, so they're doing it as a voluntary activity. They're squeezing it in and around their paid work and family commitments and all sorts of other things they're involved in. So, one of the key tasks for management is to make sure that the information boards get is as easily digested as possible. So one of the things that perhaps report writers need to do is to put themselves in the shoes of the board members and ask, if I was coming into this organisation once a month or so, what would I need to know and what would I want to know, and
how might that be presented to me that would make it easy for me to understand and get to grips with its importance? You know, there is extra work involved for management in doing that. And sometimes I talk with managers in a range of organisations that actually don't see reporting to the board as one of their core responsibilities, that it is central to their job. It's part of them expressing accountability to their board in the same way that the board expresses their accountability to members, say, if it's an incorporated society, or to funders and other key stakeholders. So it's really important to do the rework which enables that material to be as easily absorbed and interpreted by the board as possible. I have to say, though, that boards themselves are not blameless. You know, too many boards blame management for poor or too much information, as I said earlier, but they haven't really worked out and stated clearly what information needs they actually have. And what tends to happen over time, particularly as new board members come onto the board, each person will have a different level of curiosity and a different interest. And frequently what happens is that what started off perhaps as a simple set of documents coming to the board to report against by management actually grows over time, because each new board member suggests, oh, wouldn't it be good if we could have this piece of information or this piece of analysis? And the board, often without any thought at all about what the resource implications of that is, will simply say, hey, that's a good idea, let's make sure that that's added to the report. And over time, management get required to report more and more on greater and greater detail. And so it would be a good idea for both boards and management together to, from time to time, do a complete audit of the information that's coming to the board and have a really good cull. I've certainly seen it in many different environments, that information that was of interest to one board member is collected and becomes part of the routine and continues to be collected and reported long after that particular board member has lost interest in that information or has left the board. So some sort of zero-based information review is quite valuable from time to time. And I think boards need to be encouraged and have a bit of pushback from management as well. When more information is requested, I think if the chief executive or whoever might be having to prepare the information is able to gently push back on the board as to why that information might be useful, the way that can be presented without sounding that the staff are disinterested in serving the board is just for management to in effect try and seek to understand what the board's interest is, so that they might themselves in turn make interests about how that information need or curiosity might be satisfied in an efficient sort of manner. Earlier on, I talked about the potential for boards and in fact the commonality of boards drowning in too much of the wrong information. When I was thinking about this, the sort of Goldilocks thing came to mind quite readily. So in terms of quantity, and I guess quality as well, but certainly in terms of quantity, what we should be aiming for is just right. You know, neither too much nor too little. And I would accept that that's a moving feast, to continue the food sense. Really, the amount of information that a board needs will vary over time. In fact, it was interesting in the Auditor General's report, one of the subject organisations was Te Papa, and the Auditor General noted that during a period when the Te Papa board was quite concerned about financial performance, they requested a lot more finer-grained detail on the financial state of the organisation. My guess is once the crisis had passed, they would probably say, well, we don't need all that stuff now. But that doesn't always happen. Sometimes it just gets built in to a routine and is carried on regardless.
I think the other thing which I'd suggest in terms of having too much information, because too much detail actually obscures rather than informs. Boards can always ask for more information if after deliberation they agree that it's needed. Sometimes the best way for management to approach this is to prepare a relatively brief paper, say 2 to 3 pages, and that should really be a target for most reporting to the board, that it doesn't become a telephone book pile of paper with similarly small fonts, but actually in 1, 2, 3 pages, management should be able to communicate the gist of what a board needs to know. But if then the detail that's available is included in an attachment or an appendix or something like that, individual board members who wish to can actually go into more detail than others around the table might wish to. So this is a sort of a checklist in a way. What boards need is information that's relevant. It actually relates to the board's job and responsibilities, and it's at a level which is material. That concept of materiality is quite important because, again, if too much additional information is provided which isn't material, then it just submerges boards. It draws them into that detail. I tend to think that the 2 main types of information that a board needs in this context is information that helps the board to make good decisions and to do good planning. And the second category is really so that it can check performance, it can monitor performance and judge and learn from the past. So decision and planning related information is looking to the future, and performance related information is looking to the past. Those things need to be in balance because actually boards can't do a lot with that performance related information because that's water that's already flowed under the bridge. That's historical, and we don't want boards to be spending too much time looking in the rear vision mirror. In a sense, you could say that all the other information that's provided in the context of a board meeting is just incidental information and arguably optional unless it serves a useful purpose. It worries me when I see too many board agendas where most of the items are just for information or for noting. You actually don't need to call people together for a board meeting to provide them with information these days. And this is a need to discuss and interpret and explore that information that doesn't relate to either decisions or performance. I think that can be provided to them in other ways at other times. The reference to criterion referenced information, I think this is really a significant concept because what it's saying is that boards have agreed in advance what is important. In other words, they set the criteria for things that are important to the board. And that gives a clear signal to management as to what information the board needs. So, for example, the board's governance policies, including things like strategic plans and delegation registers and the like, those all create criteria for the board to receive information. So, in a sense, management should never have to guess what information the board needs. It should take some initiative itself to actually look at those sorts of documentation and to actually work out from that what is it that the board needs. And then when it's reporting back to the board, it actually makes it quite explicit what criteria they are using in relation to the information that's being provided. So it's a bit like saying, we're providing this information to you because it will allow you to check progress against this particular element of the strategic plan. Or we're giving you this information to demonstrate that management is in compliance with this particular limitation, policy or delegation. Another factor that's related to this is something that the American governance theorist John Carter once said. He said, if the board hasn't said how it should be, it has no right to ask how it is. In other words, the board really should discipline itself not to ask a whole bunch of random questions if they haven't said, about performance, for example, if they haven't if it doesn't refer to a particular goalpost that the board has set in place in the first place. I wouldn't want to take that too literally, because I think a board should be entitled to ask any question that it likes as part of its stewardship responsibility. But what Carver was saying was that there should be some discipline applied to what the board seeks information on, so that it doesn't just end up with management in a position of having to just scattergun information at the board, hoping some of it might be relevant. Just before I go off that, so a couple of other things on there. Timeliness I touched on before. I don't think there's any need to say anything more about that. Accessible. I'm going to talk about this in relation to Elizabeth's question about financial reporting in a moment, but basically the information that's provided to the board should be intelligible, and in that context I would say that it comes back to who are you writing for. I see too many really well-written management reports to boards that are practically unintelligible to the board, because it's like the staff member concerned has written that report to impress subject matter peers, for example. So it's relatively unlikely that the board will be full of subject matter experts. So a lot of the language, a lot of the acronyms, a lot of the assumptions that are made about what people around the board table actually know are quite misplaced. So another thing that I also say to management teams when they're reporting to boards, that board papers should stand on their own feet. In other words, they should be self-contained. It may be that that board paper is a follow-up to something that was discussed in the previous board meeting, but staff should never assume that board members remember any element of that discussion. And I don't mean to be disrespectful to boards in that regard, but the reality is that there's a whole bunch of other things going on in board members' lives, and they come into a monthly or even a less frequent board meeting. They switch on, well, they hopefully have switched on before they come to the meeting because they will have read all their papers. But as soon as they walk out the door, unless they have some sort of personal action to follow up on, basically they will park that organisation and until the next board meeting, and they won't give any further thought to it. So important thing to do is to present board papers which actually assist board members to get some degree of continuity between the last discussion that they had on the topic and the current one. The final thing on the screen is about accuracy, and I can tell you that nothing causes boards to lose confidence in management teams quicker than to have the experience of material being reported to them that subsequently proves to have been inaccurate. Board members have to have confidence, particularly in the numbers that are reported to them. And if they shift around a lot, then board members really get quite nervous. And I think that's probably, the reason for that's probably quite obvious. So presenting information to the board, I like the idea of a dashboard. And on this slide, I've got a couple of different examples of dashboards, one in a small plane and the other one in a car dashboard. I guess we just focus on the car one for a moment. If you're driving a car, you're very seldom conscious of spending a lot of time looking at what is really important performance information, which is on that dashboard. There's maybe half a dozen different pieces of information on that dashboard, some of which only occasionally becomes important. For example, the fuel gauge, and another might be the rev counter, which in the picture I've given you on this slide, you'll see that the rev counter is almost in the rev. In other words, this is a car that's going extremely fast and the engine is really working hard. And that probably is quite important, but for most of us, keeping within the speed limit. That's not information which is terribly useful to us, except in particular circumstances. Obviously, the speed that the car is travelling at is very important, because I guess we all experience these days speed limits that can vary in a very short distance, and we need to be constantly alert to making sure that we are aligned the speed we're going with the restrictions on that particular piece of road. There are other things on that dashboard that may or may not be important at different times, and there are warning lights as well on that dashboard. In fact, there is one on that picture that I've shown you. So we want to have a similar approach at the board level, because when the organisation is travelling really fast, then you want the board to be focused on the road ahead, as in driving a car, in this case driving very fast on a German autobahn. You can see in the picture vehicles ahead, and they're probably coming at you quite fast. There may be curves coming up you need to slow down for. I think that metaphor is very applicable to the way the board steers an organisation. It doesn't want to become distracted by spending a whole lot of its board meeting time trying to analyse detailed information. It wants it in front of it and in a form which is easily accessible. A friend of mine who's got a new car took me for a ride the other day, and the information that's on the dashboard is not even on the dashboard. Well, it is on the dashboard, but it's also projected onto the windscreen. So, in fact, it's called a heads-up display, so that actually the driver can continuously be looking at the road ahead and still see what that dashboard information is. I've put the small aircraft dashboard in there because obviously some organisations are more complex than others, and there will be a lot more pieces of information that the board might need to be aware of. So it's really over to the individual board to work out what should be on its dashboard, and I think that's a really important conversation for board members to have with their management teams. And this is for Elizabeth's benefit in particular, but I think for all of us. One of the big challenges for organisations in the sector, in fact in the not-for-profit world generally, is that there's often across the whole board a relatively low average level of financial literacy. There might be a token accountant on the board, and the risk is that people defer to that person for any interpretation or analysis of the financial reports. I think that's a really bad thing to do. I think it's unfair to that person who is financially literate. I think the whole board has to recognise that collectively the whole board is responsible for the financial well-being of the organisation. So I really favour as much of the financial data as possible which is material to the board's governance responsibilities to be presented in a visual as well as a numeric form. And here's an example, really simple example of how, and this could be a dashboard type graphic, and just to build the slide. So this is a ratio which tells the board whether the organisation is solvent or not, in a short-term solvency measure. So, in effect, can we pay our bills on time? So, where the ratio is 1 to 1, the board is barely able to pay its bills. So, it's a question then, a policy decision, as to what the target ratio between current assets and current liabilities should set. The textbooks actually all say it should be at least 2. But in fact, in our sorts of organisations, it's likely to be a lot lower. And so setting the target ratio is part of the board's policy-making responsibility. And then it can expect management to report against that. And on a month-by-month basis, show a trend line. And what this graphic shows is that there is only 1 month out of about 6 where the target ratio was not achieved. But the other thing that having information with trend lines in it does is actually show what the direction of travel is. And in this case, it's in the wrong direction. So the board needs to be able to see that big picture as well. And it's really hard to do that from the sort of financial reports that many boards get, which is just a snapshot as at the end of the last month. So the long-run trend has to be there, and the policy non-compliance situation, you'd expect that that month the Chief Executive would have reported, and it may have been that there was quite a simple explanation. It might have been that if the organisation pays its staff on a fortnightly basis, there are 2 months in the year when there are 3 pay periods in a month, and so that may have explained that blip, but it doesn't take away from that long-term trend. So we may pick up, although we've pretty much run out of time, I apologise for that, but the financial stuff may warrant further discussion. So I'm going to stop at that point, Helen, and again, I apologise for having taken so much time over some of that.
No, that's great. Thanks, Graeme. I mean, I just had I don't know if this is one of these intelligently naive questions, but in terms of the format of information, I assume most organisations, most boards prefer to receive hard copies of papers and things, but is there a trend in terms of the kind of paperless world that we're increasingly in for boards to receive information, remotely online, via presentations and things, as opposed to, using lots of trees?
Yeah, that's definitely happening now. I would say that it's well past the tipping point now. Most boards that I engage with, at least some of the board members will only receive electronic versions of the board papers. Yeah. Some may still prefer to have a hard copy. And the financial stuff actually is still quite difficult to see on an iPad or something like that because it's hard to navigate through a spreadsheet, which often might be in paper form, might be in say an A3 format, for example. One of the problems that I point out with going to that sort of soft copy approach is that it's getting even easier for additional data, unprocessed information to just be dumped into the board pack. And I've already got boards that have started to complain about that they get overloaded with stuff because it's so easy to add new reports, new publications and that sort of thing to the board meeting pack.
Interesting, thank you. And I also wondered if it would be possible to get hold of the link for the Auditor General's report that we might be able to circulate. Would you know how to obtain that? I thought that could be quite useful. So anyway, I know we're over time, but I just wanted to, in particular, take this opportunity to thank you, Graeme, sincerely on behalf of Creative New Zealand and all the participants over the past year. These webinars have been incredibly informative, and you always provide such articulate and concrete examples. They've been incredibly useful, so thank you. And also finally, to let you all know that the past Getting on Board webinars are on the Creative New Zealand YouTube channel, and I think we've got a playlist where you can view all the different topics. So I do encourage any of you who haven't seen the other webinars to take a look at those. And please do take a few minutes, if you can, to complete the survey we have to let us know how you found this webinar and how relevant it was and how effective it was, because that truly helps us with the evaluation around this particular capability offering. So thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you again to you, Graeme, and bye for now. Ka kite.